Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive?
Let's do it.
Today, we're jumping into Francis Schaeffer's The God Who Is There.
This one is a real mind bender.
It is. We're tackling this idea of a line of despair, this point in history where, according to Schaeffer, everything changed. Like how we see truth, how we make art, even just what we believe about the world.
It's like we went from building our worldview on solid rock to suddenly quicksand.
Exactly. And Schaeffer wants to show us how we got there. But before we cross that line, paint us a picture. What was the world like before this big shift?
Okay, so imagine a time when, even if people weren't like super religious, they still generally acted like there was a right and wrong.
Okay, I'm with you.
Like honesty is the best policy. Even if you couldn't give a philosophical argument for it,
Yeah.
you still kind of lived by it.
Interesting. So there was this shared understanding of a moral compass, even if it wasn't always clear why it pointed north.
Exactly. But then, boom, things start to shift. Schaeffer points to the late 19th century in Europe, a bit later in America, as this turning point.
So not a sudden break, more like a slow, creeping change.
Yeah, like a crack in a windshield, slowly spiderwebbing out.
Okay, so how does this crack appear? What's the first sign of trouble?
Schaeffer uses this image of a staircase, right? Each step is a different part of culture, and they all start tumbling down this line of despair.
Okay, I'm liking this staircase image. So what's the first step on the way down?
Philosophy. It changes first. Then art follows. Then music takes a plunge. Then the culture at large stumbles down. And finally, even theology gets swept up in the fall.
It's like a domino effect, one area impacting the next.
Exactly. And at the top of those stairs, the one who kicks off this whole chain reaction? Hegel.
Ah, Hegel. Famous philosopher, but I'll admit his work isn't exactly light reading. Give us the gist. Why is he the first step on this downward spiral?
Okay, so before Hegel, most people thought about truth like a straight line. A causes B, B causes C, nice and tidy.
Makes sense. A plus B equals despair.
Not quite. But Hegel comes along and says, nope, it's not a line, it's a triangle. He throws in this idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. Like, imagine him sitting in a cafe suddenly telling his buddies, guys, we've been thinking about truth all wrong.
Huh. I can just picture it, turning the philosophical world upside down over a cup of coffee.
Right. He's basically saying that truth isn't found in this linear way of thinking, but in the clash of opposing ideas.
So instead of a clear right and wrong, it's all about merging different views. That does seem messy.
You said it. And that's exactly what Schaeffer's getting at. This shift from a straight line to a triangle, it might seem abstract, but it opens the door for a whole lot of uncertainty, a lot of moral relativism.
Okay, so Hegel kicks us off down the stairs of despair. Who's next to give us a philosophical push?
That would be our old friend, Søren Kierkegaard, the godfather of existentialism.
Existentialism. Now, there's a word that gets thrown around a lot. What's the quick and dirty definition, and how does it fit into this line of despair business?
In a nutshell, Kierkegaard said that you can't just reason your way to ultimate truth. You have to take this leap of faith, something completely irrational, a jump outside of logic.
So he's saying reason and faith are like oil and water,
Yeah.
totally separate.
Exactly. And this idea, wild as it might seem, becomes the foundation for both secular and religious existentialism.
Hold on, two types of existentialism. Now my head's really spinning.
Don't worry, it's not as complicated as it sounds. Think of it like two sides of the same coin. Both are grappling with this idea of how do you find meaning in a world stripped of those absolute truths Hegel messed with?
Okay, so it's less about the type of existentialism and more about this core belief that ultimate truth can't be reasoned with. It's more about feeling than logic.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
this idea, it starts to seep into everything, from how we view ourselves to the art we create.
And that's how we're moving down the staircase, right? From philosophy to these other parts of culture.
You got it. It's all connected, this cascade of changing ideas. But let's unpack those other steps a bit further.
Okay, so we've gone from like deep thoughts to actual, paintings and sculptures. Who are the artists who decided to paint this new world, this world without absolutes?
Well, you can't talk about this era without mentioning the Impressionists. They were like the bridge between, the old way of doing things and this whole new wave.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Like, they were still painting like trees and flowers and stuff, but there's this new focus on light and how it like hits your eye, a kind of experimentation that hadn't really been done before.
So they were already pushing boundaries, but who took the next step? Who really took that tumble-down Schaeffer staircase?
Well, think Van Gogh, Gauguin, Cézanne. These guys were all searching for some kind of universal language through their art.
I can see that. It's like they were trying to express something, I don't know, something bigger than themselves.
Totally. They weren't satisfied with just painting pretty pictures. They wanted to grapple with the big questions, the meaning of life, the nature of reality, all that stuff.
It's interesting you mentioned Van Gogh. His paintings are so raw, so full of emotion, and his life, as we know, was tragically cut short. Do you think his own struggles, that search for meaning, are reflected in his work?
Oh, absolutely. Van Gogh's life was marked by this deep longing for connection, for something to hold on to. He even tried to start this artistic community, kind of a utopia for artists, but it fell apart. Imagine pouring your heart into something, believing in it so strongly, and seeing it crumble around you.
That's heartbreaking. It's like he was experiencing that line of despair on a deeply personal level and then translating that onto the canvas.
Exactly. And then you have Gauguin. Remember that whole noble savage idea? The romanticized notion that people living closer to nature, they were somehow more authentic, more in tune with some kind of primal truth.
I vaguely remember that from like high school literature class.
Right. So Gauguin was completely captivated by this idea. He actually picked up and sailed to Tahiti, hoping to find that primal truth for himself.
He literally went to the other side of the world to find meaning. That's dedication. Did he ever find what he was looking for?
Well, he found beauty, that's for sure. But if you look at his later work, like his painting, What, Whence, Whither, you see this existential angst creeping in.
Even in Paradise, he couldn't escape those big questions.
Nope. It's like even surrounded by all that beauty, he was still wrestling with the same doubts, the same uncertainties.
So even escaping to a tropical island couldn't outrun the line of despair. That's kind of a depressing thought.
Well, it's not all doom and gloom. It's more like they were trying to figure it out, to find a new way to express meaning in a world that seemed to be losing its grip on it.
I see what you're saying. It's like by trying to create this new language, they were also highlighting the very problem they were trying to solve.
Exactly. And speaking of trying to create a new language, we can't forget about Picasso.
Ah, Picasso. Now there's a name everyone knows, even if they don't know much about art. But how does he fit into all of this?
Picasso was a total genius, no doubt about it.
Yeah.
But his work, it's like this fascinating map of the line of despair. He started out with incredible technical skill, like really traditional. But then, gradually, his work became more and more abstract, those cubist paintings with the faces all jumbled up.
Right. It's like he was trying to capture something beyond what you could just, see with your eyes.
Exactly. He was moving away from representing the physical world in a realistic way and trying to get at something deeper, something more universal.
I gotta admit, I've always found Picasso's later work a bit confusing. Like, I'm missing some kind of secret code or something.
And that's part of the point. By breaking down those traditional forms, he was also breaking down our easy understanding of the world. It's like he was saying, hey, things aren't as simple as they seem.
So he was expressing that growing sense of, isolation, that breakdown in communication that seems to go hand in hand with the line of despair.
Precisely. And you know who takes this even further? Piet Mondrian.
Mondrian. The guy with the squares and rectangles, what's his deal?
Okay, so those squares and rectangles, as simple as they seem, for Mondrian, they represented this search for pure harmony, pure balance. He was obsessed with finding order in a world that seemed to be spinning out of control.
Wasn't he, designing whole rooms based on these geometric shapes? I feel like I read that somewhere.
Yeah. He didn't just want to paint these ideas. He wanted to create entire environments that reflected them.
There's this great anecdote about Mondrian freaking out because a museum put a frame around one of his paintings.
Seriously, why would he care about a frame?
He felt like they were totally missing the point. He saw his work as an extension of the space, not something to be contained. But here's the irony. These perfectly balanced spaces he was creating, they didn't really have room for actual people. It's like he designed a utopia that excluded the very beings it was meant for.
It's like they were so focused on these grand ideas, these universal truths, that they lost sight of the human element. Exactly. And it's not just these few artists, right? This sense of disillusionment, this feeling of being unmoored, it starts to seep into everything: music, literature, film.
So we're not just talking about fancy art galleries and museums anymore. This line of despair, it's trickling down into everyday life.
Exactly. It's like a virus. It's everywhere. But it's not always obvious. Sometimes it hides in plain sight.
Okay, so we've traced this line of despair through philosophy, painting, even those super serious sculptors. What about music? Doesn't music, like, capture the mood of the times, too?
Oh, absolutely. Just like those paintings were getting more abstract, music starts going through its own revolution.
So less Beethoven, more.
Yeah.
What's the musical equivalent of a Picasso painting?
Well, Schaeffer points to Debussy as a key figure here. He starts messing with traditional harmony, creating these sounds that were totally new for their time.
So he was kind of like the impressionist of music, breaking the rules, shaking things up.
Exactly. And he paves the way for even wilder stuff. Schaeffer talks about this genre called musique concrète that emerged in France.
Musique concrète. Okay, now you've got to explain that one.
So imagine taking everyday sounds, like, I don't know, the screech of a train, a baby crying, whatever, and then manipulating them, like chopping them up, slowing them down, and turning them into music.
So it's not exactly Mozart, right? What's the point of all that sonic manipulation?
That's the interesting part. The idea behind musique concrète was to reflect the uncertainty, the fragmentation of the modern world. It's like they were saying, hey, even the sounds we thought we knew can be distorted, just like our sense of truth.
Whoa. So it's not just about the music itself. It's about what that music represents, what it's trying to say about the world.
Exactly. And this isn't just happening in some like avant-garde music scene. This whole line of despair thing, it starts to pop up everywhere.
Okay, so how does this, like, philosophical crisis play out in the real world for people who aren't, hanging out in art galleries and listening to experimental music?
We'll take someone like Henry Miller, for example. This is a guy who wrote some pretty, let's just say, provocative novels.
We talked about the stuff that got banned back in the day.
The very same. But here's the thing. Miller's writing, as shocking as it wasn't just about being scandalous. It was his way of expressing this deep sense of meaninglessness, this feeling that nothing really matters.
So it's like he's taking those big, heady philosophical ideas and, like, bringing them down to earth, making them raw, making them personal.
Exactly. And then you have John Osborne, one of those angry, young British playwrights from the mid-20th century. He writes this play about Martin Luther, of all people.
Wait, Martin Luther, the Reformation guy? That seems like a weird fit for this whole line of despair thing.
I know, right? But that's what makes it so interesting. The play itself is actually pretty faithful to Luther's life and beliefs. But the way Osborne frames it, the ending especially, it's pure 20th century angst.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. How does a play about Martin Luther end up reflecting this modern sense of despair?
So picture this.
Yep.
It's the end of the play, and someone asks Luther if he knows he's right, about his beliefs.
Right, it's a big moment, a chance for Luther to give some grand speech about faith and conviction.
Exactly. But instead, Osborne has him reply with, "Let's hope so."
Let's hope so. That's it. No thundering pronouncements. No unshakable certainty.
Nope. And that's the whole point. Even Martin Luther, this towering figure of faith, in Osborne's play, he's touched by doubt, by uncertainty. It's like this line of despair has seeped into even the most steadfast beliefs.
That's a powerful image. It's like no one is immune to this cultural shift, this creeping sense of doubt. And it's not just happening in these, highbrow plays and novels, right? It's seeping into everything.
You got it. Think about the music of the 60s, for example, the Beatles. They started out with those catchy, optimistic tunes. But as the decade wore on, their music became more introspective, more experimental. You even hear it in Dylan's shift from folk to, well, Dylan being Dylan.
Wow, you're right. I'd never really thought about it that way, but it makes total sense. This line of despair is like a cultural undercurrent, shaping everything from high art to pop music.
And that's Schaeffer's point, isn't it? To make us aware of these undercurrents, these shifts in how we see the world and ourselves. Because once we're aware, then we can start to ask ourselves the important questions. What do we believe? What gives our lives meaning? Where do we find hope in a world that seems to have lost its way?
Such a powerful thought to end on. It's a reminder that these aren't just abstract philosophical debates. They have real-world consequences for how we live our lives, how we interact with the world, and how we find our place in it. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive today. Remember to subscribe to the show, tell a friend, and until next time, keep asking those big questions.